Thank you so much for joining us. There's three of us going to contribute to this presentation. Myself and Jo will be taking the lead on it. Miranda Cumston, who many of you will know, will come in at the end of the presentation. Miranda's just come off a houseboat on a river in our part of the world in Victoria. So we're lucky that she managed to join us tonight, but that's the reason why she's not doing more of the presenting, because she's been instrumentally involved in this particular project. So the project we're going to talk about tonight is it's part of the Cochrane Public Health projects that were launched last year, short projects to develop some practical tools for review authors. This particular project is really aimed at helping review authors develop their questions, particularly more complex review questions, but really we think this work will apply to anyone and is particularly useful for new authors who are grappling with how to go about develop their questions, and also for editors and people peer reviewing. So we're calling this SynQ, which is a checklist and guide for defining the questions to be addressed in the synthesis of public health intervention reviews. But as I said, we think it's much broader. We have got many examples in the tool that are drawn from public health, but much broader than that. Myself and Jo McKenzie have been leading the overall project, but it's very much built into the doctoral research that Miranda has taken on. Miranda, as you know, is a very, very experienced systematic reviewer, been working in methodology and training in systematic reviews in Cochrane for a very long period of time. Alongside us has been Rebecca Ryan, who some of you will know from the Cochrane Consumers and Communication Group. Rebecca was involved in running Chapter 3 with us, which much of this work has drawn on, and has been contributing throughout to the projects that we'll talk about tonight, including the development of the checklist. Okay, so I'll just kick off. So as I said, this is one of the suite of projects that was supported by Cochrane at the end of last year. This is Project 2, which was aimed at developing practical guidance to frame public health intervention review questions, define outcomes and choose appropriate study designs. We decided at an early stage that there was enough in the question formulation without focusing on the study design, so it's really focused on that aspect. So I'm going to start the sort of main part of the bit that I talk about by going through some background and introduction. Then I'll hand over to Jo, who will outline the checklist. Then we're going to do some practical work, and we hope you stay with us. It won't be scary practical work. It's just a bit of an opportunity to get into a breakout, meet a Cochrane colleague or someone else with an interest in systematic reviews, and just have a little bit of a look at one or two of the items that we've developed and have a chat about that, what you think might be working well, what's understandable, what perhaps could be done a little bit differently, because we'd very much like your feedback. After we've done that, we'll ask Miranda just to outline what we're doing in terms of evaluation and how you might contribute if you'd like to do so. Okay, so historically, authors have focused on defining the scope and eligibility criteria for their review, what we call the PICO for the review, and the Cochrane template really reflects this review level defining of questions. However, within reviews, we have a separate question answered by each of our syntheses, each of our meta-analyses, for example. So the concept of PICO for each synthesis was introduced in version 6 of the Cochrane Handbook to encourage authors to define each of their synthesis questions, recognising that, in fact, we have many questions within a review and we don't always go into the detail of defining some of those questions more specifically. These might include the questions that are used for each of our comparisons, so the questions that define our meta-analyses or other syntheses, or any other synthesis questions. So they might be what people would commonly think of when they think of doing subgroup analyses or meta-regressions, or thinking about possible causes of variation in the intervention effect. So either of those might be part of your PICO for each synthesis. So why define specific questions for the synthesis? Well, we think it helps authors. We think it helps them clarify the questions they want to address in their reviews, plan how they'll structure their synthesis to address each question, because there are often many different ways we can go about addressing a single question. and make best use of the data. So accounting for those scenarios where perhaps we don't have very many studies to answer a very specific question, and perhaps we're prepared to make some compromises and ask both specific and broad questions within our review. This kind of planning will involve things like thinking about how the interventions and outcomes will be grouped for the purpose of synthesis. We also think it helps authors deal with the very diverse PICO of their included studies. So very often, if we don't define our questions very well, and we've been in this position ourselves, what we find is we're met with a bit of a mess, a really difficult kind of situation of making sense of quite diverse studies, things that perhaps we didn't anticipate. And we're really thinking here that if we shift some of that work to the beginning of the review process, that personally, when we've done reviews, we find it takes us a bit more time at the beginning, but really pays off when it comes to trying to make sense of the diversity of PICO questions for our included studies. We also think it will help readers, editors, and peer reviewers. So by defining our questions well, it means that our readers, people editing our review and so on, can really understand what we're trying to achieve in terms of the questions we're asking. Confirm that those planned syntheses we have actually will address the question, so that there's a very good match between our planned approach and the questions we're aiming to address. Strangely, it also helps people find the answer to the question. So one of the things we've found in one of the background projects that Miranda's led for this work is that it's often quite difficult to match up what people say they're going to do and the actual syntheses they conduct. So being able to make sure that you can find the answer to the questions that were of interest is a really important thing. And finally, defining those questions well is an important way for those using your review to feel confident that you haven't changed your questions. And so while a minority of reviewers, a tiny minority of reviewers might do this, there have been some good empirical studies showing that, in fact, it is possible to manipulate the questions by manipulating which studies go into your synthesis, leading to potentially getting more of a desired result. And that's something which, of course, we've got a strong commitment to protect against bias. So one of the other, perhaps lesser advantages, but a very important one if it happens to occur, of defining our synthesis questions. Just want to take a minute to look at a specific example to make this a little bit more concrete. And this is one that we talk a lot about in our teaching example, because we've been doing a lot of teaching to try to implement the findings, the content of the handbook chapters in our centre. So an example, a review that we might consider would be this one, a review of exercise for increasing bone density in postmenopausal women. A review such as this might have various types of interventions eligible for the review. So let's say that the review authors have specified 3 types of interventions for inclusion: walking their dog, yoga on the beach, or cycling. So we've got 3 possible interventions eligible for inclusion, and they're listed under types of interventions. But it raises a question immediately of, will the synthesis address one question, a question about exercise, or 3? So if we've got one question, it might be something like this: does exercise increase bone density in postmenopausal women, leading to all of the studies that were eligible for that review being included in a single meta-analysis. However, so that's a fairly straightforward kind of scenario, but one which possibly doesn't happen that often, particularly in complex public health reviews. In reality, in this review, the authors actually answered 4 questions. Each of those questions was determined based on a combination of whether the interventions were weight-bearing and the force exerted in that exercise. So there were, in fact, 4 synthesis questions within this broader review. Those questions really are defined by our PICO for synthesis. So we've got one broad PICO question for our review. Within that review, we've got 4 specific questions that define our synthesis. And it's that kind of definition that we're focusing on in this checklist. This is where I really would have got Miranda to talk had she not been on the houseboat having a lovely time. This is a study that she's led. It's a study looking at current practice in defining the PICO for synthesis. So the basis of this study was really to look at the kind of expectations we'd laid out in the Cochrane Handbook chapter and see the extent to which they were being applied in current reviews. Knowing that this was new guidance, we weren't expecting to see fantastic practice, but we did expect to see some of the kind of features for defining review questions or the questions for synthesis that we had thought might be commonly applied. So Miranda looked at a sample of 100 published systematic reviews. And there's obviously a lot of specific findings, but just to give you a flavour of what we found, first of all, it was surprisingly difficult to work out what the synthesis questions were. So we could tell what the broad review question was, but we weren't clear at all how people were going to actually configure their synthesis to address more specific questions within their review. We also couldn't tell whether the questions that the authors wanted to address had actually been addressed. So we really couldn't determine whether the synthesis had simply been dictated by what the studies found. And in many cases, it kind of looked like that was the case, particularly where the synthesis was very split, so very narrow outcomes and so on, that looked very much like things that were in the individual studies rather than a kind of planned synthesis by the authors. Okay, so in the context of that, knowing that there's a background of practice that really could be improved, where we could do a better job of defining our questions, we started to think about how we could do that. So we had obviously developed this guidance in the Cochrane Handbook chapter, and while we would like to think that guidance alone would be sufficient to enable people to follow the kind of practices that we hope they will be implementing in their reviews, in reality, I think we need to provide much more practical tools for people to be able to implement this guidance. It's complex. It's not easy to actually write review questions. We try to turn it into a science, but there is an art to it, to be fair to authors. And so the aim in the tool that's being developed through this project is really to break down the elements of a fully specified synthesis question and allow people to try to address that in the review by using a checklist approach. Ideally, this will make it easier to implement the guidance for authors and to describe what to do when you're working as an editor or a peer reviewer, because in our experience doing methodological reviews of systematic reviews, while it's relatively straightforward for us to say, you need to use the ROB2 tool, you need to consider this domain, you need to then bring that assessment into a grade assessment, for example, we can be quite concrete in that. Trying to describe to authors what's missing out of their review question, what to do differently, how to configure their synthesis appropriately and reflect that in their review questions, it's actually a very difficult thing to describe. So breaking it down into a series of steps that can be presented in a checklist ideally will help facilitate the process of feeding back on review questions and authors being able to respond to that feedback. Okay. A question that I think that we are already getting that many people worry about when they see another checklist is, will the checklist be more work or lengthen reviews? It's a really legitimate question for all of us to ask because we know that reviews are getting increasingly complex and time consuming to do. And so to kind of try to reassure you about this, I wanted to put up just an example, and this is an example from a very clinical review. It's about interventions for motor rehabilitation in patients with below-knee amputation. This is an example where many of the principles that we've got in this checklist are demonstrated very, very nicely in terms of articulating the review question. And what they've done is really a matter of structuring and actually making sure that what they're planning to do is made explicit in their review, whether that's in the protocol or the final review. So here really we're looking at their intervention description, and this example of an intervention description perfectly meets the items that we've suggested in item 1, 3, 5 and 6. What they've done here is, you'll see on the left-hand side, they've got a brief label for each of their intervention groups. They've got a clear definition that would lead to criteria that they could operationalise when they're looking at the individual studies to decide which studies are eligible for each of these groups. And then they clearly state their comparison. So each of those groups and the comparator appear here. So we can easily identify what their plan is for setting up their meta-analyses and how these groups will be used in the synthesis. It's very transparent. It's not a whole lot of text. but it absolutely meets the requirements that we're suggesting in these 4 items, which is nearly half of the checklist items. So we hope that once people get used to using the checklist, and I'm about to hand over to Jo to introduce the checklist to you, that you will find that it is not as onerous as it might initially seem when you start to work through the guidance. Okay, Jo, I'll hand over to you. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you for that. And I'll try to start sharing my screen. Where are we? Okay. Hopefully you can see that. So what I'm just going to briefly do is, first of all, really give an overview to the checklist. The checklist, some of you may have seen it. It's been out for consultation for a little bit of time now. And if you have seen it, at the moment it constitutes quite a full document. And that document really contains, I guess, 3 essential elements. So there's also a preamble to how to use the tool. Then there's the checklist itself, which is just roughly around 2 pages in length. And then we have basically item elaborations, and I'm going to speak more to these particular sections of the checklist. And following that, we have a set of examples. So in some ways, it's very much set up like the risk of bias tool, or those of you who might have used the PRISMA 2020 statement extension document. At the moment, the document that's out for consultation represents those kind of extended documents. But what we really envisage is that in practice, review authors, once they're familiar with the tool, or if they're experienced review authors and editors, in fact, all they would need to consult would be the checklist, which is only 2 pages long and consists of 10 items. So that's a bit of a background just to the document as it stands at the moment. So what I want to do here is I just want to briefly introduce you to the items. As I said, the checklist includes 10 items. The first 2 are essentially around specifying the population and intervention groups that are going to be used in the synthesis, as Sue was talking about, and also the outcome groups that will be used in the synthesis. The next item is really about providing a rationale for why you have chosen the groups that you have. And then the following 2 items are really being very explicit to say what the role of each of these groups are in the synthesis, and also to specify the pairwise comparisons that you're intended to be made between the intervention groups. This 6th item is ensuring that everything kind of lines up. So it's ensuring that the objectives align with the questions that are defined for each of the syntheses. And then 7 is about specifying the methodological groups to be used in the synthesis. So, for example, whether you might be wishing to examine whether risk of bias might explain some of the heterogeneity that you observe in your results, for example. And then 8 is around describing the process that you use to actually decide which studies are eligible for each synthesis. And this item is actually directly comes from PRISMA. It's item 13A in the PRISMA statement, but it's directly of relevance here. And then the last 2 items, item 9 is around identifying changes that are made at the review stage to the groups or the comparisons reported in the protocol. Obviously, these things, there are valid reasons for changes to be made, but these should be reported. And then the last item is about reporting the results in accordance with the groups and comparisons specified in the methods. So that means that really it's very easy to basically follow through the review for how the description of the groups, for example, and the background and methods follow through to the results. So it's very easy for a reader to make those links. These first 7 items are really reported in both the protocol and the review. and then the other items 8 to 10 are reported in the review only. Okay, so to speak further to the actual specific item template, what we have here, you'll see, is we've got an explanation for each item, essential and additional elements. The explanation is really obviously describing what the item is about and also saying why it's important to report the information. The essential elements are things that we really ideally would like to have reported in every review. And then there are additional elements that are things that we think might enhance reporting, but are not necessarily essential. And this kind of essential and additional element structure very much reflects the way that Prisma has moved, Prisma 2020, where we have an item and we also specify what the essential elements of that item are and what the additional elements might be. And then we also have the reporting and conduct guidance references. So we make links for a particular item to Prisma 2020, the SWIM reporting guidelines, Messier or Messiah, depending on how you pronounce that, guidance, and also handbook guidance. So we basically link to the other guidance documents as relevant. And we also have an appendix of examples for each item in the checklist. So let's just have a look at the first item. So this is the specified population intervention groups to be used in the synthesis. So we have an explanation here, and we also are providing really what we think should be reported. So we provide the reasons for why we think the information should be reported. We also provide information about where it would be best placed to report that information. So that within the kind of Cochrane template at the moment, there are kind of obvious places to report certain information, but for some of the items, there are not kind of specific headings. And where that information might be reported could be kind of spread in different sections. So we try to kind of guide where it might be best to report the information for each of the items. And for the first item, these are the essential elements here. So this is what we would be expecting are reported. And then the additional elements of potentially information that should be reported. And this is the additional links to external documents that it's useful to consult. So for this particular one, Prisma 2020, item 5 and item 13E, we have reference to the SWIM guidance, Messier, and the handbook chapters, and also additional resources that might be useful would be the tidier checklist in this example. And then, as I said, we have a set of examples which we're hoping to really build upon. At the moment, the examples are mainly for public health, since this was the direction of the project, but really it's the case that this tool can be applied more than just for public health focused reviews. It can be applied obviously for clinical reviews as well. So we really want to kind of build a bank of examples that demonstrate complete reporting and incomplete reporting. So what I might do is just pause here. So what we're going to do shortly is obviously move on to our, we've got an exercise for a feedback session. But before we move on to that, I just wanted to give people the opportunity if they had any questions for around the kind of structure of the document, or any questions for Sue at this point in her presentation. Ella, you've got your hand up there.
Hi. Sorry, thanks. Really interesting presentation, and really good to see this this development. I had a question. So it's about kind of reporting versus conduct standards. And I don't know if that's a little bit kind of off topic, but there's a lot about reporting in here. So would you see this as a reporting checklist or reporting standards, or would you see it also as conduct standards, or how would you define basically the difference between the two?
Yeah, look, I mean, Sue will probably be able to answer this better than myself. So, but we have had quite a lot of discussion around this, and that's for good reason here, because in many ways the reporting is almost the conduct when you're specifying your questions. I don't know whether you want to add to that, Sue.
Yeah. You're muting.
The classic mute. It's a long day and it's just before break. I think it is a really intriguing thing in the case of this, because obviously you do a risk of bias assessment, and that's something you're doing in the conduct. It's very obvious. I think in terms of your questions, the way you do the doing of questions is to write them, really, and I think the two are synonymous. It's just sometimes you might do some behind the scenes kind of work to prepare those questions, to develop those questions, to think about how that's all going to be operationalised in your synthesis, but you forget to tell your reader all that detail. And so just making those links, and Miranda, could talk on this topic, and it would be really interesting to hear her talk on the topic of the study she's done, where one of the really common things we do is people set up these questions, then they don't tell us anything about how they're going to answer them. So we don't really know whether these beautiful groups they're using, have defined, are going to be used for comparisons or as subgroups or just as headings, or whether they're just there to give us a sense of the scope of the review. And it is really, I think the two are synonymous here. The doing, the conduct, and the reporting are really probably one of the same.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Great. Are there any other questions at this stage?
They don't seem to, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what we want to do now is to really give you the opportunity to feedback, and we would be very grateful to hear that. There is also another way that you can feedback by looking at the Untitled, and Miranda will be able to come in and talk at that at the end. But what we've decided is to just pick out a couple of items. And the items that we've picked out are the specified population intervention groups to be used in the synthesis. Item 1 and item 4 specify the role of each group in the synthesis. And what we'd like you to do is, there is a URL here, and I think Sue might have put that into the chat. And if you go to that URL, what you'll find is there is a I've put item 3 in. Is that,
yeah, sorry, Joe. I just realised that link I've given you is one with item 3. So I'll just put a new link in the chat for everybody.
Okay, so a new link's coming.
It will be in the chat.
While Sue's doing that, I'll just explain what we're seeking. So basically, we've got each item there, and we've got the explanation. And what we really want you to think about is we're going to put you into breakout groups with, I think, 3 people in each group. So we want to give you some time, obviously, to read the item and the explanation, and then to really think about these questions here. Do you agree with the proposed item, including the essential and additional elements? And then if you can think about whether you agree, but you feel like there might be some changes to the wording, or whether you disagree. And we're really seeking you to think about that for both the essential and additional elements, and also the explanation. So, yes. So you've got 2 items. You can choose to focus on one or other, or both if you have time. And what we'll do is, when we come back, it would be great to kind of hear your feedback about those items. And also whether you have kind of any other comments, general comments about the structure, the length, whether you feel like we might be missing anything if you've had the opportunity to kind of look over the checklist. So I think we might kind of move on to that, Ella, now, if you can do that.
There's a question in the chat. I don't know whether you want to address that now or after the breakouts. It says, when you're determining the possible comparisons for the review, if there's no obvious primary comparison, do you have a suggestion for selecting which is presented as the primary synthesis? So, for example, in the summary of findings table for the review, just thinking about a review we conducted with 9 active comparisons versus placebo. We ended up presenting the first alphabetically as the primary synthesis at the time, as there was no clear guidance how to select which one.
Yeah, look, thank you for that comment, Joe. That is an interesting comment. I guess what we're trying to do here is to get people to really report what the comparisons are. And it might be the case, for example, that you don't have any reason for ordering those comparisons in a particular way. And so you're kind of considering them similarly in terms of their importance. Sometimes, of course, we've had a bit of feedback on the checklist to say that, sometimes, it might be that there's kind of interventions which are much more usual practice. For example, the kind of comparisons that are involving those groups might be brought forward for some reason. And if that was the case, that you kind of had some hierarchy of importance, then that would be important to actually note that. I don't know whether Sue or Miranda wants to add to that. I take silences.
I think that was well said, Joe. I think it's, in terms of guidance about selecting it, I'm not sure that we can give any, because it really depends on the review and the questions for the, as you say, the hierarchy of importance within a particular review, but how that then translates to the publishing structure, I'm not sure that we can address that.
Yeah, and it is an important thing, that kind of specification of comparisons, because of course, as soon as you end up with multiple intervention groups in a review, the number of comparisons, can become very large. And so, there does need to be some justification as to what you are comparing. So it is an important issue.